Veronica Manning had always been the picture of grace and charm, the perfect wife to Nicholas, a successful attorney. From the outside, their life was immaculate. A beautiful home, thriving careers, and a marriage that seemed unwavering. But beneath the polished surface, cracks had begun to form. Her once radiant smile no longer reached her eyes, and her laughter, once genuine and light, now carried a hollow echo. The weight of her secrets pressed heavily on her shoulders, suffocating her with each passing day. What had started as a harmless flirtation with Grant, a charismatic, unpredictable client, had spiraled into something uncontrollable. Stolen moments, whispered words, lingering touches. It had all intensified, weaving a web of desire and deceit that left Veronica breathless and afraid. Each time she looked into Nicholas's trusting eyes, guilt clawed at her, threatening to consume her. But the pull of Grant was intoxicating, impossible to ignore. Nicholas remained oblivious, caught up in the demands of his work, leaving her alone with her thoughts, her temptations, her ever-growing deception. Each day felt like a countdown to disaster, the walls of her perfect life closing in around her. What once felt like stability now felt like a fragile illusion, teetering on the edge of collapse. The affair had not been planned. It had unfolded with an inevitability that terrified her. At first, it had been innocent, a few lingering conversations, a touch of flirtation that made her feel alive in a way she hadn't in years. But one evening, temptation overpowered reason, and they crossed a line that could never be erased. Their bodies had gravitated toward one another with an intensity that thrilled and terrified her. Now, every touch, every stolen glance, felt like a step closer to an inescapable abyss. Veronica had convinced herself she could keep her two worlds separate, her carefully constructed marriage and the passionate chaos of her affair. But the boundaries had begun to blur, and she could feel the weight of her deception pressing down on her like a heavy storm cloud. Every time Nicholas kissed her forehead, his voice warm with affection, she felt like a fraud. And every time she met Grant in secret, she felt a rush of exhilaration laced with dread. She had built her life with Nicholas on a foundation of trust, and yet, here she was, betraying everything they had created. The guilt was no longer just a passing ache, it was a constant, gnawing presence, poisoning every moment. The house that once felt like a sanctuary now felt like a prison, the walls whispering reminders of the truth she was so desperately trying to hide. Nicholas had begun to notice the shift in her. He came home earlier, lingered longer, watched her in a way that made her stomach twist. There was a quiet tension between them now, a distance that neither of them addressed but both could feel. He asked about her day with a tenderness that made her throat tighten. He reached for her hand at dinner, and she hesitated just a second too long before taking it. The silence between them grew heavier, thick with unspoken words. She wasn't sure what scared her more, Nicholas discovering the truth or the possibility that he already suspected it. The thought of losing him, of destroying the life they had built, sent a wave of panic through her. But the thought of ending things with Grant? That was equally unbearable. One evening, as she sat alone in the kitchen, her phone buzzed with a message from Grant. "We need to talk." The words stared back at her, their weight pressing down on her chest. Her fingers trembled as she typed a response, knowing that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. The days that followed felt like a slow, excruciating unraveling. She moved through the motions of her life with Nicholas, cooking meals, exchanging pleasantries, pretending. But the tension had become suffocating. She could feel it in the way Nicholas watched her, in the way his questions lingered just a second too long. That evening, when he walked through the door, she sensed it immediately, the shift in the air, the heaviness in his posture. He sat at the kitchen table, his shoulders sagging under the weight of something unspoken. The sight of him like that made her stomach twist. For the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to really see him, the man she had loved, the man who trusted her. She wanted to tell him everything, to spill every secret and beg for forgiveness. But fear gripped her throat, keeping her silent. The fear of losing him. The fear of destroying everything. The fear that, no matter what she chose, she had already lost control. So they sat there, the distance between them an unspoken chasm, neither willing to break the silence. And in that moment, Veronica realized the truth. No matter how desperately she tried to hold on, the life she had built was already beginning to crumble. Veronica Manning stood before the bathroom mirror, her hands gripping the cool porcelain of the sink, knuckles turning white. The reflection staring back at her was a stranger, her wide, haunted eyes a testament to the turmoil brewing within. It had been a week since that fateful night with Grant, a reckless decision that had unraveled the careful tapestry of her life. The weight of it pressed on her chest like an iron vice, suffocating her beneath layers of guilt and fear. Nicholas had noticed. He hadn't said anything, but Veronica felt his quiet suspicion creeping into their home, into the spaces between them. His once warm embrace had cooled, his gaze lingered a fraction too long, searching for something she wasn't ready to admit. The controlled perfection she had spent years cultivating now felt fragile, teetering on the brink of collapse. The sharp vibration of her phone against the countertop jolted her from her thoughts. She didn't need to look to know who it was. Grant. The name alone sent a current through her, a tangled mix of fear and longing. We need to talk. Her pulse quickened as her mind raced. She had promised herself it was over, that night had been a mistake, a moment of weakness she could lock away and forget. But the truth was far more insidious. She couldn't stop thinking about him, about the fire he had ignited within her, a hunger she hadn't felt in years. A sudden knock at the door sent a spike of panic through her, shattering her spiraling thoughts. Nicholas. His voice was calm, steady, but there was something beneath it, something she couldn't quite place. She froze. For weeks, the tension in their home had been unbearable, the air thick with unspoken words and unasked questions. The smallest interactions, passing him his coffee, answering his casual inquiries about her day, felt heavy, as though they carried a meaning she couldn't escape. His silence wasn't oblivion. It was calculation. He was watching her, waiting, and she knew it was only a matter of time before the walls came crashing down. She had told herself that if she played her part long enough, the weight of her betrayal would ease, that she could mold her life back into the perfect image it once was. But with every stolen glance at her phone, every time Grant's name flashed across the screen, that illusion slipped further away. That night, as she sat at the kitchen table, the cold glow of her phone illuminated the message that sent her heart into a free fall. "We can't go on like this." A chill raced down her spine. The words echoed in her head as she stared at them, knowing that they were true. She couldn't keep pretending. For years, she had convinced herself that she was in control, a master of the delicate balancing act between duty and desire. But as she sat in the suffocating quiet of her living room, Nicholas across from her, his presence heavy with something unspoken, the truth hit her like a freight train. He knew. Maybe not everything. Maybe not the details. But enough. His usual warmth had been replaced by something distant, something sharp and unreadable. It was as if she had become a stranger to him, and in that moment, she realized she already was. Guilt twisted inside her like a blade. How had she let it come to this? How had she been so reckless, so blind to the inevitable collapse of everything she had built? The love, the trust, the life she and Nicholas had created, it had all been real. But now, it was slipping through her fingers, reduced to a fragile, trembling thing on the verge of shattering. Late that night, Veronica sat on the edge of their bed, the city's distant hum filtering through the window. The weight of everything bore down on her, pressing into her ribs, stealing her breath. Her thoughts drifted to Grant, to the way he had made her feel, alive, unchained, desired. But desire had turned into something darker, something suffocating. What once felt like an escape now felt like a cage. And now, Nicholas was still here. Alive. Breathing. A fact that should have brought relief but instead filled her with an unbearable sense of dread. Her choices had led her here, and now there was no running. The game was over. Days passed, each one heavier than the last. She had thought she could keep spinning her world, controlling the unraveling threads. But no amount of pretending could erase what had already been done. The tension between her and Nicholas had become an unspoken storm, a quiet war waged in glances and silences. She found herself watching him in moments of stillness, her heart lurching at the thought of how much she had taken for granted. The trust in his eyes had faded, replaced by something guarded, something distant. She had broken something between them, something precious, and she didn't know if it could ever be repaired. And still, Grant lingered in her thoughts, his presence a ghost she couldn't exorcise. The passion that once thrilled her now felt like an anchor dragging her deeper into the abyss. She had thought she could keep her two lives separate, but now the lines had blurred into something indistinguishable, something inescapable. The weight of it all pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. She knew the reckoning was coming. She could feel it in the way Nicholas's eyes lingered too long, in the way the spaces between them had become unbearable. The question was no longer if everything would come crashing down. It was when. And when it did, how much of herself would be left standing?